Hey everybody, if the book of Revelation is not a prophecy about the year 2023, then what is it? Well, it's a piece of apocalyptic literature. I think that's the best place to start. And apocalypse is a genre of literature that developed within the post-exilic and the Greco-Roman periods within Judaism. And it's adopting a lot of features of prophetic literature, but then adding some additional motifs and imagery to it as a way to prophetically peel back the fabric of the universe to show the otherworldly nature of God's side of that equation, and to show that ultimately God is in charge, and that the unimaginably powerful empires around the Jewish people who are persecuting and oppressing them, or who are at least perceived to be doing so, are going to get what's coming to them. And so in some ways, it's a fantasy about all the people around us who are causing so many problems for us getting what's coming to them. And I would argue that this is, in large part, one of the inspirations for the concept of hell. We're not seeing such unimaginably powerful and evil and violent people getting their just desserts during their lives, so let's fantasize about them getting them after they're dead. So I would argue that that is the origin of this idea of post-mortal divine punishment, and it gets elaborated on and innovated on and developed into what we understand today. But I think it probably originates in these attempts to find comfort in imagining these people having their power stripped from them and receiving punishment at the hands of God. And so this is aimed at the Hellenistic empires. It's aimed at Rome. It's probably aimed in some of the little hints in this direction at Babylon, as we see in some places in Isaiah and some places in Zechariah and Ezekiel and other pieces of prophetic literature. But it most fully is developed in Daniel, in the Enochic literature, and then in the book of Revelation. So when we look at the book of Revelation, we shouldn't be trying to understand it as a prophecy about what's happening today. And there's nothing helpful in trying to identify what going on today is being represented with this first century imagery. We can better understand it by trying to understand what that first century imagery meant to first century Christians. And when we try to understand it that way, we see it as a fantasy about what was going to happen to Rome, and a fantasy about the powers that were causing so much trouble being destroyed, falling to the ground, and everything being handed over to the people who were suffering under that power. Now, it's not deconstructing this power. It's not saying there's a better way and we're going to show this better way. It's not the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, no, the world's idea of success and power is not the Christian idea of success and power. The book of Revelation is saying, no, that's the idea, but we're just switching places with them. So it's not tearing down or deconstructing the system. It's fantasizing about trading places with the people who are causing so much trouble. So it does not really fit very well with the rest of the New Testament's presentation of God's power and God's will. And that's why it was resisted for so long by so many Christians. They did not like that aspect of it. They did not like the aspect of the wealth and the power and the resources and the control and the violence that was going to be handed over to those who overcame, because that did not fit with the ascetic perspective that so many Christians prioritized in the late first century CE. Asceticism was the priority for so many Christians, and Revelation was just saying we are going to glut ourselves on everything that they all have and are denying us right now. So that fantasy was considered inappropriate by a lot of people. However, in the 4th century CE, as a lot of the debates about canon are developing, the book of Revelation became helpful within the Arian controversy, which was not really settled at Nicaea. That was basically just the initial volley. It would go back and forth for decades to come. But the book of Revelation is one of the texts of the New Testament that seems to give more ammo to those folks who identify Jesus as God, since it talks about the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, and Jesus identifies with those titles. And so, although it was problematic for so many Christians, it was helpful for other Christians who were trying to overcome what they thought of as the heresy of Arianism, and so it was something that was brought back into the fold and ultimately included in the canon, even though it so wildly conflicts with the way the Gospels present Jesus and the future and God's will. So it is a book that was written to exhort Christians to remain faithful in the face of persecution by comforting them with this fantasy about trading places with the hated Romans. And it was not accepted by most Christians up until the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, when many of them, the ones in charge, realized, hey, this is helpful for structuring our own power in terms of Christological debates. And so it ultimately gets brought near enough to be around when it comes time to seal off the canon and gets included in the canon, and now today gets misunderstood as a prophecy about our time, and it is not a prophecy about the future. It is apocalyptic literature intended to bring comfort to and intended to exhort Christians in the first century to faithfulness to the church, to Jesus, and to the gospel. Now, one of the biggest problems with deploying this text as a prophecy about today is that the author is trying to exhort the reader and the hearer to remain faithful in the face of persecution. And so we need to see ourselves as the persecuted, as the oppressed, to be able to identify with the people for whom the text is written. But Christians are not the persecuted and the oppressed in most parts of the world. There are absolutely parts of the world where they are overwhelmingly oppressed, and that is an enormous problem. But for people in the United States of America who are trying to see themselves as the oppressed in here, they have to gin up some kind of powerful enemy. And what that usually means is treating the people we are oppressing as the oppressor, treating them as the enemy and fantasizing about them getting what's coming to them. And unfortunately, that usually just facilitates more oppression. And the idea that we are all buying into this fantasy about the end of the world and about so many people being brutally massacred, the idea that people would enjoy this, that people would spread the idea that this is on the doorstep, this is happening now, has traumatized so many people. And so when privileged and powerful groups deploy this text as a prophecy about today in places like the United States, it causes untold trauma, and it further victimizes the people we are already marginalizing, minoritizing, and oppressing. And so that use of the book of Revelation is misguided and harmful, and one could even argue unchristian.